Who created Shogun? And how did a series about early 17th century Japan conquer the world? In this video, I'll tell you about the person who journeyed from a prisoner of war camp to becoming the author of Shogun, what the first adaptation of the famous novel was like, and how an Arab sheikh offered millions to its author. The novel Shogun was written by James Clavell. On the one hand, like any writer, he simply sat down and wrote the book. But of course, there's more to the story. Why would a Briton, born in Australia and living in the United States, write a book about an English navigator in 17th century Japan? To understand this, we need to start from the very beginning. James Clavell was born in Sydney in 1921 to a military family. His grandfather and father were officers in the British Royal Navy. According to legend, his family lineage traces back to Walter de Clavell, who was a major landowner during the time of William the Conqueror, but we won't delve that far back. As the son of an officer, young Clavell travelled around the world, and in school, he began to show an aptitude for languages skills that would later prove useful in writing his multinational novels. His further education was interrupted by the onset of World War, and Clavell decided to follow in the military footsteps of his ancestors, enlisting in the army. However, he served not in the navy, but in the artillery. This is where a significant part of his life began, one that would profoundly influence his work as a writer. Clavell served in Asia, specifically in the Malayan jungles, fighting against the Japanese. He was wounded in a machine gun attack, hid in a local village for a time, but was eventually captured by Japanese soldiers. This was in 1942, and Clavell remained a prisoner until the war's end. He spent 3 years in 2 camps, first in Java, but mostly in Singapore's Changi prison, which was then under Japanese control. Is infamous for the horrific conditions the prisoners endured. Only 1 in 15 survived, including Clavell. The future writer survived, and captivity left a profound mark on him and his works. He delved even deeper into Asian culture and languages, but most importantly, the torture, hunger, nightmarish conditions, and relationships between prisoners and guards became part of his first novel, King Rat, which tells the story of life in a prisoner of war camp. King Rat was published in 1962 and was based on Clavell's harrowing and tragic experiences. It's a story about a Singapore POW camp, a book about survival in war, but far from the front lines. The participants in this war also had to fight for their lives, but in a place where no explosions could be heard. Peter Marlowe, one of the characters in the novel, is Clavell's alter ego. Marlowe is a somewhat prim Englishman, well-educated, and raised in a family with military traditions. The character appears not only in King Rat, but also in other works, becoming part of the literary universe that would later be known as the Asian Saga. Clavell called King Rat a catharsis, a purging release of long-held emotions. He wrote this book at the insistence of his wife, who believed it would help him cope with the memories of his time in captivity. Only after the novel was published did his nightmares cease, and he overcame the habit of always keeping a can of sardines on hand. IN 1965, a film adaptation of King Rat was released, starring George Segal, Tom Courtenay, and James Fox. The movie had a moderate box office performance, but it was well received by critics and earned 2 Oscar nominations. But before his first novel and its adaptation, a few other events shaped Clavell's life. After being released from prison, Clavell was given a leave, which ended unpleasantly for him. He had a bad motorcycle accident and was forced to leave military service due to his injuries. Shortly after, he met his future wife, ballerina and actress April Stride. Though her filmography isn't particularly notable, she was the one who persuaded him to take up writing. They married and moved to the United States, where Clavell initially struggled. To make ends meet and support his family, he worked as a carpenter. A similar twist of fate happened to Harrison Ford, who nearly abandoned his acting career to pursue carpentry before George Lucas came along. Clavell, due to his wife, often found himself in film circles and gradually became more comfortable there. He had already begun learning about film distribution back in England, but in America, he decided to fully immerse himself in film production. In New York, where the Clavells initially settled, the future writer started writing scripts for television, and within a few years, he made his way to Hollywood. Clavell first became a screenwriter, starting with the science fiction film The Fly, and then a director. His first film, 5 Gates to Hell, reflected his past, focusing on Asia, war, and captivity. But this was just his first attempt to channel his experiences into film. He continued directing and writing scripts, mostly for low-budget films, which, while decent, didn't gain much attention. Clavell gained real recognition as a screenwriter in 1963. That year saw the release of The Great Escape, now a recognized classic, featuring stars like Steve McQueen, James Garner, Charles Bronson, and Richard Attenborough. Besides working on the script, Clavell also served as a producer. While the film was directed by John Sturges, a legendary director of Hollywood's golden age. As we can see, the themes of imprisonment and war remained central to Clavell's work, and how could they not, after 3 years spent in Changi? But it turned out that The Great Escape was only a warm-up before a deeper dive into his painful past. Screenwriting, producing, and directing did not distract Clavell from his main passion. He continued to write. In 1966, he released the monumental novel Tai-Pan, my favorite of the entire Asian saga. Its full original title is Tai-Pan, a novel of Hong Kong. The action takes place in 1841. The novel is about British traders who want to open up the Chinese market. The book contrasts Western and Asian mindsets, and through the main character, Dirk Struan, Clavell conveys his own worldview. The novel was commercially successful, and the rights to the book were immediately bought. However, the film adaptation took 20 years to materialize. The legendary producer Dino De Laurentiis acquired the rights, and the film became the first English-language movie shot in China within the Chinese film industry. It all sounds promising, but the film was a spectacular failure. Clavell stated that he never even watched it and wanted to reclaim the rights to create a new version as a miniseries. But unfortunately, that never happened. In 1975, Shogun, Clavell's third book, was released. The inspiration for the novel came from a line in a book he was reading to his daughter Michaela. In 16, an Englishman went to Japan and became a samurai. This is the story of the sailor William Adams, who became the first Englishman to visit Japan. He and his companion, Jan Justin van Lodenstein, were unable to leave Japan and became the first European samurai. In the novel, the protagonist is named John Blackthorne, a man who arrives in Japan at the beginning of the 17th century. If you've read the novel or watched one of the adaptations, you already know the characters, many of whom are based on real historical figures from Japan at that time. For example, Yoshi Toranaga is based on Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, the feudal military government that ruled Japan until 1868. The other characters in the novel also have clear historical counterparts, even if they appear under different names. These are truly important people who played a significant role in shaping Japan during that era. In 1980, the first adaptation of Eshgun was released, a series that had a significant impact on American television. One of the factors that led to the series' creation was another show that aired a couple of years earlier, Roots, which tells the story of the enslavement and liberation of a family. Besides the external similarities, such as being a historical miniseries based on a popular novel written by Alex Haley, not to be confused with Arthur Haley, Roots and Shogun shared success on television. Roots opened the door for small-scale series, becoming the most watched show on American TV, earning 36 Emmy nominations, and still ranking among the most popular shows in American TV history. After Roots, many TV networks wanted something similar, and it was inevitable that they would turn to Shogun. NBC created two versions of Eshgun, the full miniseries, consisting of 5 episodes and a heavily edited version that was cut down to a TV movie, losing much in the process. It's better to watch the full miniseries, which we'll discuss further. Initially, Sean Connery was highly sought for the lead role of John Blackthorne, but he laughed at the idea when he heard that filming would take place in Japan. He had a very unpleasant experience filming You Only Live Twice there. Considering the film was released 13 years prior, it's clear Connery was not eager to return to the land of the rising sun. Other candidates included Roger Moore and Albert Finney, a 5-time Oscar nominee who played Hercule Poirot in Murder on the Orient Express in 1974. After Connery turned down the role, Clavell himself wanted Finney to explore the landscapes of Japan and was against Richard Chamberlain, who ultimately played the role. However, after the series aired, Clavell was very pleased and called Chamberlain's performance magnificent. The director of Shogun was Jerry London. At that time, his filmography wasn't particularly notable. He had a large number of credits, but few standout works. Perhaps the most memorable was the sci-fi horror Killdozer, a title that suggests it leaned more towards fantasy than science. He mostly directed mediocre films, and some episodes of popular series at the time. Apart from Chamberlain, the cast of Shogun included Toshiro Mifune, who was already the most famous Japanese actor at that time. He gained this status through his work with Kurosawa. John Rhys Davies, although his most prominent roles would come later, he would appear in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark just a year later, and the series Sliders would air only 15 years after. Of course, there would also be the iconic rivalry with Legolas. Mariko, the character so beloved by audiences in the modern adaptation, was played by Yoko Shimada in the original version. At the start of filming, she didn't know English, so she worked intensively with a coach. This helped, but some complex sentences and words still had to be rewritten during filming. There are many differences between the 1980 version of Shogun and the modern one. The original version was a trailblazer for American television in many ways. It was the first show entirely filmed in Japan, not a plus for Sean Connery. It was the first time the word piss was spoken on television, which had previously been taboo, a ban that seems absurd now. It also showed numerous brutal scenes, something that hadn't been done on TV before. The decision regarding the Japanese language was particularly interesting, considering that the series is about a European who arrives in Japan for the first time. A lot of Japanese is spoken in the series. These dialogues were not only untranslated, there weren't even any subtitles. Hi, tunnel. This provided an excellent experience for the viewer. They could feel like John Blackthorne, who also didn't know the language and could only guess what was being said through facial expressions and context, although he was often deprived of context. This same translation choice also changes the perception in The Old Shogun. The entire story is told from the perspective of the main character. It is through him that we become familiar with this world. In the new version, we are made aware of the interests and perspectives of all the participants, making the series less centered on a single character and shifting the focus from Western thinking to Eastern. Both approaches are good, and it's not about comparing which is better, but this allows us to appreciate the importance of such a seemingly technical detail as subtitles. Thus, in the 1980 series, more attention is given to John Blackthorne. His character became the link between the viewer and the little-known historical Japan. The narrator, played by Orson Welles, was also supposed to be a guide, but I feel that his role wasn't prominent enough in the series to be truly significant. The series was well received. In fact, not just well received. It is estimated that Shogun was watched by about 33% of all households in the United States. Imagine that. The series drew a third of the country to their televisions. To further illustrate its popularity, restaurant attendance across the country dropped during the week of its broadcast. The episodes aired daily. This was also due to the fact that not many viewers owned VKs at the time, so everyone was eager to watch it live. The novel also soared, becoming the best-selling book that year. With this, Clavell's influence grew. He became a true bridge between the two nations. He participated in presidential dinners when the Japanese Prime Minister visited Reagan and spoke at conferences on East Asian studies. However, there was some criticism. Many accused him of distorting historical facts, but he deftly brushed these off. When speaking to professionals, he claimed that he was merely interpreting them in his own way for a work of fiction, while he assured more general audiences that this was indeed the true history. In Japan, the series received mixed, almost negative reactions, mainly due to the story's lightheartedness. At that time, Japan was also producing its own shows focused on the country's past, providing a basis for comparison. It is believed that Clavell, his book, and the series based on it sparked a genuine wave of Japanophilia in the USA. According to legend, likely exaggerated Shogun also led to a significant increase in the number of sushi bars across America. Though who knows, perhaps a few Japanese restaurants did open during the show's peak popularity.
Some uni.
You probably already know how the series that came out this year turned out. It became a true revelation of the TV season, but the story is no longer focused on John Blackthorne. One of the executive producers was Michaela Clavell. The writer's daughter, the author himself, passed away 30 years ago, in 1994. It was to her that he read the story that inspired him to write the novel, so in a way the story has come full circle. Along with the decision to add subtitles and increase the importance of the Japanese characters, the show also indirectly responds to another aspect. If The Old Shogun was filmed only in Japan, the new one was filmed everywhere, but not in Japan. All those beautiful views, the recreated old Osaka, the fishing boats in the bay, they're all in British Columbia, a Canadian province. The plan was to shoot where the story takes place, but the pandemic not only disrupted the schedule, but also created these kinds of challenges. The production designer was Helen Jarvis, who worked on the adaptation of Warcraft the 13th Warrior, and for example another Asian blockbuster, although this time about China, The Great Wall. That film, by the way, was shot in China, and even became the most expensive film ever shot entirely in China. It's quite surprising that Jarvis not only has never been to Japan, but also hasn't read Clavell's novel. This didn't affect the quality of her work, although perhaps the series could have been even more visually stunning under different circumstances. Blackthorne was played by Cosmo Jarvis, who was somewhat criticized for his overly irritable and lost demeanor. But after all, his character found himself in an unfamiliar world, where people speak an unknown language. I think we can forgive him for that. Yoshi Toranaga was played by Hiroyuki Sanadai, who may not be as iconic as Toshiro Mifune, but he fits very naturally into the role of a smart and powerful daimyo. Sanada is already a well-known actor, having appeared in John Wick, the recent Mortal Kombat. And of course he has experience playing historical Japanese roles. He was a samurai in The Last Samurai, a ronin in 47 Ronin, and now he's reached the rank of daimyo. Anna Sawai won over many with her portrayal of Mariko. Sawai's career has just begun, but it's already off to a strong start. Before Shogun, she appeared in the 9th Fast and Furious movie, Apple's series Pachinko, and the MonsterVerse franchise show Monarch. The series is closer to the original than the first adaptation, and by presenting the world through the perspectives of the Japanese characters, it becomes both more comprehensible and more captivating. These characters also evoke more sympathy when you understand their motives and goals. The series ended at the same point as the novel. Initially, the creators mentioned that the series would have only one season, but due to its popularity, it was extended for 2 more seasons. Considering that Clavell's novel is based on real people and historical events, it's easy to assume that the plot will continue to develop as it did in reality. Personally, I would love to see other works by Clavell adapted for the screen. After Shogun, Clavell wrote 3 more books in his Asian saga, all set in the East: Japan in Gai-Jin, Hong Kong in Noble House, Iran in Whirlwind. Clavell wrote the entire Asian saga out of chronological order, sometimes going further back in time and other times moving closer to the present. But this didn't stop him from mentioning some characters across different works. For example, Peter Marlowe from King Rat appears in Noble House here. He is a former soldier visiting Hong Kong with his wife to explore it and write a novel about its history. Remember I mentioned before that Marlowe is a reflection of Clavell himself in his books? Other characters also wandered from book to book. Some, like Marlowe, played important roles in the narrative, while others, or even their descendants, were merely mentioned as a pleasant surprise for devoted readers. There have been 5 adaptations of Clavell's novels in total. Besides the 2 versions of Shogun, there was the solid King Rat and the failed Tai-Pan, as well as a miniseries starring Pierce Brosnan. In 1988, the year I was born, Noble House was released, continuing the story of Hong Kong's business tycoon. Plus, the antagonist in the series was played by John Rhys Davies, who became one of the highlights of the show. The series didn't match the popularity of the first Shogun, nor did it reach the level of adaptation of the second one. Much from the book didn't make it into the series, and some parts were added to fit the visual storytelling. Noble House still holds up quite well today. Yes, some moments feel a bit dated, and the pacing is uneven, but it's still enjoyable, especially with the excellent cast. James Clavell did a lot for the relationship between Japan and the US with his books. According to rumors, or perhaps even legend, a very wealthy sheik once asked Clavell to do the same for the Middle East as he did for Japan. He became an excellent example of a writer who turned his difficult life experiences into the pages of books that, while not as heavy, are incredibly captivating. Critics have called Clavell's novels both epic and silly, great and childish. But what's wonderful is that we can form our own opinions about them, and regardless of what you think of them, they certainly won't seem boring. If you enjoyed this video, it would be great if you could give it a like. And to make sure you don't miss the next one, you can also subscribe to our channel. My name is Max. Goodbye to everyone.